Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Today is April 15th. We are going to be doing a few things today. We have three sources that we're going to be reading from. We're going to be reading from this book, Genocide in Paraguay. It's a book by Richard Ahrens. We're going to read chapter 5, which the title of the chapter 5, is Genocide and Ethnocide, Reflections on Genocide and Ethnocide. Okay, the other book we're going to be reading is, this one. There's going to be a short part where we read this one, Dispossessing the Indian, book by Wilbur Jacobs. It's just a book about dispossessing the American Indian. It's about the American Indian disposition. And finally, the third book, an additional book is, we're going to try to get to this one, 10 Years of Military Terror in Indonesia. And then there's one more book. The fourth book is Washington's War on Nicaragua, Holly Sklar's book, which is, a good book. So I just want to read, this basically, I just want to talk about the American historical recollection, the history that I've read and what I find in this book. The racist white American, cruel, sadistic, congressional savages of white supremacist fascism and ethnic hate against all world peoples, ethnics, is extremely startling. You are sadistic, mass-murdering, psychopathic misfits. The U.S. government, including its Congress and president, justice system, and its people, and the American people, have universally agreed in using torture techniques against U.S. citizens who are presenting democratic ideas in all media forums, force submission to them of censorship, rewrite the history, and remove what really happened. Remove the real history and replace it with a white supremacist fictional novel that is devoid of historical value and useful for promoting American imperialism and ethnic slaughter. This is a group of white quacks and mass murderers of ethnics, enjoying their prestige on the world stage at the expense of hardworking ethnic peoples who were formerly the white man's colonial subjects. A group of white racists fabricating quacks with a history reflected by total fraud. These are sadistic, angry, detached, cruel, psychopathic misfits and angry, anti-democratic, fascist mass murderers and genocidal butchers of the United States of America. They love anti-democratic fascism as an easy fix to their ethnic slaughter campaigns and racist imperial exploitation. Censorship, fabrication, and reinvention, fascist depiction, and anti-democratic replacement. They are white quack psychopathic misfits. So again, the most important thing is to understand they remove the real history. They basically use torture techniques against U.S. citizens who are presenting democratic ideas in all media forums, for forcing them to submit to censorship, rewriting the history, and removing what really happened. They replace it with a white supremacist fictional novel devoid of any historical value and useful for promoting their imperialism and ethnic slaughter, American imperialism and ethnic slaughter. You can see that's a group of white quacks and mass murderers. They are, racist, fascist, white supremacist, frontiersman type, sadistic, cruel, detached butchers. So we're going to start with reflections on genocide and ethnocide in Richard Ahrens' book. One cannot read Mark Munzel's and Norman Lewis's account of the condition of the Apache Indians in Paraguay without pity and outrage. Yet it is not easy to secure a moral perspective that will take the full range of evil that is encompassed in that condition. From the most elementary civil liberties point of view, it is plain that as individuals, the Apaches are deprived of all legal rights and are denied the most basic protections that we recognize as indispensable to a morally acceptable society. Moreover, we have come to understand why slavery is wrong, though it took us in the United States an excessively long time to reach this level of moral awareness. And even at this day, we are far from adequately concerned about conditions of life such as those of many migratory farm workers that are in some respects difficult to distinguish from slavery and amount at least to peonage. The treatment of the Achees include the still more terrible wrong of genocide. As Richard Ahrens explains later in this volume, genocide, in the sense in which it was prohibited by the United Nations Genocide Convention of 1951, consists in the commission of acts of a certain specified sort with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Genocide aims at the extermination of a group, or at least of its dissolution, by killing or incapacitating its present members, and or by interposing severe physical obstacles to their replacement as group members. As Ahrens argues very persuasively, following the lead of Raphael Lemkin, among the genocidal acts must be included deculturation, or the deprivation of one's culture. Deculturation as a means of achieving death has been studied for decades, and its lethal effects have been demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt. Clearly, where the loss of culture destroys self-esteem and the will to live, what Chaim Shaitan calls psychic death, we are faced with direct and patent genocide. To conceive of the assaults against culture as a means of genocide is certainly one important way of regarding them. In the present context, however, I want to focus on another aspect of the matter that has not really been stressed, though it has been touched upon by other contributors to this volume. For quite apart from its predictable physical effects, deculturation must be considered a wrong in itself, indeed as ethnocide. By analogy with the Genocide Convention, we might define ethnocide as the commission of acts of specified sort with intent to extinguish utterly or in a substantial part a culture. Among such ethnocidal acts are the deprivations of opportunity to use a language, practice a religion, create art in customary ways, maintain basic social institutions, preserve memories and traditions, work in cooperation towards social goals. To exterminate or disperse a social group whose members are the sole bearers of culture is to commit both genocide and ethnocide, but the former is, of course, not necessary for the latter. We may be insufficiently ruthless, as John Ehrlichman once characterized Richard M. Nixon, to carry through the barbarity of earlier times, the extermination of the entire city's population, or the decimation of European Jewry. But then we must stamp out the culture before we have killed its bearers, taking away from them everything they need to be fulfilled as persons, to accept themselves and each other as worthy of respect and love, and to have roles and relationships that give life order, to find a purpose in living. This is perhaps the ultimate cruelty, and it can be carried out largely by underlings who are sufficiently ruthless to be oblivious to the enormity of what they are doing. Though if it is to be done efficiently, someone nearer the top must have a deliberate plan. Mark Munzel's example of how culture is taken from the Achees are clear and telling enough. Bereft of social structure, of traditional art and religion, of hope, and even of one's real name, it is understandable that one might abandon any will to live. Mass murder can express the profound jealous fear that the victims may be better than, may have it in them to surpass in some way their murderers. This is the American government, the white quacks of the American government, the racist, sadistic, cruel, detached, anti-ethnic quacks who set up the Ache Indians for genocide because of their racist, jealous delusions against the Indians. Slavery affirms inferiority, but is compatible with acknowledgement of humanness. Culture destruction reduces the human to what is less than human, perhaps the most culpable oppression of all. To condemn the government of Paraguay or its rulers or their subordinates for ethnocide against the Achees is to recognize a moral obligation on their part not to interfere with and not to permit interference with Ache lives and culture. And this is, in turn, to acknowledge a right that is being violated by actions that threatens the very survival of the group as such. Group survival cannot be abridged under the laws of genocide. And genocide is clearly the fate of the Apache Indians on the basis of the documentation furnished in the preceding chapters. So again, you remember the American government, the racist, mass murdering, sadistic, cruel, detached, anti-ethnic, hateful quacks put General Stroessner in Paraguay as a way to genocide the Indians. Any willful disruption of culture must, as I have said, be judged to involve an act of genocide. But what I wish to emphasize is that it also involves a distinct and different wrong, the wrong of ethnocide. How then are we to conceive a right whose violation is this wrong? There are two ways of considering this problem. Of these, the more direct and less debatable is to regard individual men and women as having a right to their culture. If there is such a right, it would certainly have to be a universal and very fundamental one. In other words, a human right. So it is not surprising to find such a right alluded to in Article 22 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted in 1948 by the General Assembly of the United Nations. Everyone as a member of the society has the right to social security and is entitled to realization through national effort and international cooperation and in accordance with the organization and resources of each state of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality. The phrase from Rupert Moses, quoted by Richard Aarons in his introduction, is the right of cultural expression, but this must be taken to include participation in the varied forms and strands of activity that constitute a culture, as well as having appropriate roles in the institution that articulate the social order. Some philosophers question the existence of human rights, and it is true that we do not yet possess a wholly adequate theory of human rights. The concept of a legal right is, of course, less contestable. So suppose a person takes exception to the way he is treated by fellow citizens, including government officials, and can appeal to some public authority with the power to review the actions, taking into account the possible injury that may result from them, and to provide a remedy, either in the form of stopping the actions or of awarding a recompense. Such a person can be said to possess legal rights in that society. Legal rights are thus distinguished from moral rights, which do not entail the existence of any such process of authoritative review, but which do entail corresponding duties. If X has the right to use a public park, then Y has the duty to not interfere with his use of it. One may have both a legal right and a moral right to the same thing, save life or freedom of speech. One may have a moral right to something to which his society affords him no legal right, but it can be argued that because there is a general prima facie obligation to obey the law, legal rights also carry moral rights along with them. If there are moral rights, then they exist independently of social sanctions or dispute settling procedures. Some of them grow out of particular occasions and do not outlast them. Once a promise has been kept, that ends the promisee's right to have it kept. Others grow out of particular relationships, such as that between parent and child, which gives the child a right to his parent's care. But if there are moral rights that are highly general and belong to human beings as such, these are human rights. Well-known philosophical difficulties can arise trying to establish that there are such rights and in trying to determine what they are. I do not believe that human rights can be deduced from general proportions about human nature that would to derive an ought from it is. But on the other hand, I do not think we need to rest a defense of human rights on any narrowly conceived and therefore highly debatable principle of value or the good. For whatever a person or a society takes as a desirable goal in life, whatever values are espoused, whatever ways of ordering human relations are deliberately or tacitly accepted, some conditions are, at least nearly always, necessary for achievement. Of the infinite potentialities of human nature, one person or one society finds some worthy actualization. I cannot say that there are equally worthy, but only that whatever they are, their actualization will depend on certain conditions of which all human beings will therefore be in need, whether they are aware of that need or not. Again, anyone who makes moral judgments or value judgments, who asserts that actions are right or wrong, or that things are better or worse, implicitly represents himself as a moral agent. He thereby concedes the desirability of those conditions, which can be shown to make it possible to be a moral agent. The rights to these conditions, the necessary conditions of self-realization and of being a moral agent, are the human rights. They include the right to one's culture. No doubt this is all too sketchy account of a complex matter. I shall not attempt to provide the evidence that would be required to prove it that having a culture is in fact a basic universal condition of self-realization and of being truly a moral being. Perhaps no elaborate argument is needed. We can hardly conceive of those capacities that enable us to grow in ways we wish and to act in the lights of moral principle as developing without the support of a continuing set of traditions and institutions, however changeable some may be, or without the very patterns of language and thought and feeling that are embedded in a culture. Of course, there have been people who voluntarily relinquished or renounced their culture and adopted another. That is perhaps a rather rare and remarkable feat. The right to keep the original culture remains theirs, however, even if they do not choose to exercise it. This right, like all general rights, is not an absolute, but a defeasible one. In acknowledging it, we are not committed to saying that it would never be justified to take someone's culture away from him, but we are saying that this could not be justified except by the most stringent conflicting moral demands, where the conflict cannot be compromised or the parties reconciled. The right is not impaired even if the culture itself becomes impaired. Under various pressures, human or natural, significant elements may be lost from a culture. Religious traditions sometimes atrophy, political leadership falters, old forms of visual art and music can no longer be created, though new forms have yet to take their place. But so long as the culture gives support, those who are sustained by it continue to possess the right to it. The right is not a guarantee. Cultures can be destroyed by earthquake or disease. It entails only that others have an obligation to refrain from actions that interfere with one's participation in the culture one accepts as his own. There is, as I suggested earlier, a second way of regarding the problem of ethnogenocide. Besides the individual person's right to have a culture, we may conceive of the right of the culture itself, particularly structure of values, beliefs, customs, rules, to exist, to be whole. The right would entail the obligation of other cultures and individuals of those cultures not to commit aggression against it, and especially not to extinguish it. Such a suggestion will no doubt strike many as absurd. A person can have rights, but how can a culture? It is not a fictional entity, a mere abstraction, or at best a theoretical construct. I think not. It is not an abstract entity or a construct, but a particular concrete constellation of practices in a broad sense. It can come into existence, and it can end. It can have causes and effects. It has an individual physiognomy and career. It will help to put this proposal that cultures have rights into proper perspective. If we turn for a moment to broad questions about the environment, about nature in general, of which human beings and their cultures are, in a profound sense, products and expressions. It is an acknowledged characteristic of moral progress that the range of entities conceived as bearers of rights and as the objects of moral obligations has persistently, though not continuously, broadened. We can put this point by saying that we have, in the course of human history, come to recognize the existence of rights where hitherto they did not enter our awareness. In Western culture especially, the widening circles have been quite clearly marked and are still advancing, though not without frequent setbacks. And I believe that we should say that they include other organisms and human ones, at least animals, if not yet plants. Does not a dog have a moral right not to be treated cruelly? You may demur at this. Dogs are not moral agents and cannot have moral obligations. We may have obligations to them, not to treat them cruelly. But is that enough to justify ascribing to them the right not to be treated cruelly? The question is a philosophically debatable one, but it seems to me that there is at least one fairly clear and useful sense in which it is true that dogs have rights, including a right, but remember, a defensible right to life is a consideration. But dogs, after all, are sentient beings, which can be made miserable or happy within their emotional limits. They have interests. Can we go further? Recently, a legal theorist, Christopher Stone, has proposed to recognize rights in natural objects, not only trees, but forests and rivers and mountains. To be precise, he proposes that we accord legal rights to natural objects, thus making it possible for suits to be brought or defended on their behalf, as on behalf of minors, the senile, the mentally ill. Stone argues that this would be a natural widening of the circle of rights, that we already accord legal rights to non-human entities, such as corporations, and that there may be no other way of protecting, say, a river from pollution when no one is willing to complain or to complain injury, since those who suffer from the pollution are economically dependent on those who do the polluting. There are many problems with the work to be worked out. Of course, for example, what constitutes an injury to a river or mountain. But Stone believes that the concept of making whole can be fruitfully applied as a criteria of restitution. Stone's argument has been criticized by Mark Sagoff for its utilitarianism. It is people who benefit is ultimately in view. And he has worked out what he claims is a non-utilitarian alternative, which, if it can be sustained, would at least justify the preservation of remaining wilderness in the United States. A more general argument has been offered to Holmes Rolston, though he does not speak of rights, but of values. He argues that we ought to respect stability, beauty, and integrity of the whole ecological order, which does not mean we ought to never to modify our environment. The kind of ethical problem that faces us at this level is nicely brought out by a remark of Rolston's. Certain butterflies occur rarely in isolated hammocks in the African grasslands. Formerly, unscrupulous collectors would collect a few hundred, then burn out the hammock to destroy the species and thereby drive the price up of their collections. I find myself persuaded that they morally ought not to do this, nor will the reason resolve into the evil of greed, but it remains the needless destruction of even a butterfly species. So you can see, the U.S. government, they did this genocide. They exterminated the species, the Achi Indians. The whole group was genocided because they are fascist, quacks. They, are antidemocratic, fascist quacks. They, censor the real history, censor books like this by Ahrens, and rewrite them in the white supremacist quack discourse. They produce a fictional white supremacist novel of what really happened, and it's of no historical value, and it's only useful to exploit the communities through colonialism and further genocide, further ethnic slaughter by the U.S. government, white supremacist quacks, and their, including their justice system, Congress, and, president. He who tells the last pair of carrier program pigeons has also destroyed the species, but on one view he has done no worse than he who has killed any other pair. If indeed he has done wrong at all, yet on another view he has done something radically different though. The killing is a single action. It has two act properties. The bringing about of individual deaths and also of species extermination. And each act property gives the action its own moral character. The legal character of this act property, when applied to the human species, is genocide. True, nature herself eliminates species with no help from us, but that is no justification any more than the fact that everyone ultimately dies makes murder permissible. When the species goes, one of the expressions of nature's powers, a stand of her fecundity, has been lost. But is that enough to say that a species have a right to exist? That, in other words, we are bound not to destroy species wantonly for the trivial or selfish reasons? Rolston bases his argument on the concept of intrinsic value, which troubles me for various philosophic reasons. But even if we do not say that the integrity of the natural order is intrinsically good and worth preserving, we may say that it is absolutely essential condition of all human as well as other life, and its care is therefore a basic obligation. Not that destroying one species of butterfly out of the many thousands will itself upset the balance of nature any more than one person's walking on the recently planted grass will kill it, but that burning the hammock is an instance of a type of action, namely unjustifiable interference with the natural order, that must be prohibited in general if we are to avoid disaster. On this ground, we can say that species too have rights, which are distinct from the rights of the members that members have. Perhaps those who are concerned to combat anthropocentrism as the main philosophic rule of our depredations, of our will consider my justification for species rights too dependent on human interests. But I mean to rest it on the interest of all things that can have interest. I am quite willing to say that it is in part because butterflies have interest that the human race has a right not to be destroyed wantonly or selfishly, with whatever radical ecological consequences that may entail. To move from the rights of natural entities to those of cultures is no doubt a large jump, though given what we now know and suspect about the communication capacities of subhuman species, the gap between nature and culture appears somewhat narrower than it did when Ernst Cassirer proposed to define human beings as symbol using animals, animal symbolism, symbolicum. But cultures are human creations, however unconscious. Once in existence, a language, an art, and a religion, a way of cooking food or of settling disputes, has a claim upon our interest and our respect. For it is the solution of a problem that belongs to our common humanity. All ways of working, of marrying, of governing, of dancing, of responding to the mysteries of the universe, if they grow out of the experience of men and women living and working together and are not imposed by force, have something to them of worth, whatever evils they may also bring with them. To destroy a culture is to destroy some part of what humanity, in all the rich diversity of its boundless talents, has created. Even the loss of a language or a craft is a diminution of our heritage, of what we can proudly regard as evidence of the complexity, resourcefulness, and admirableness of human nature. It takes away one piece of testimony to our capacities, and hence one ground of hope for our future. Then we extinguish a culture. We extinguish part of ourselves, of what can have become. We lose another paradigm of how people can live fruitfully together, and thus narrow our imaginative vision of the range of what we could be and do. So you can see the US government, they are into destroying cultures, and they are into rewriting it into an antidemocratic, fascist, white supremacist fictional novel that they then produce for their people, who then agree with it, and then they all get together and re-imperialize and do ethnic slaughter and genocide. This is the US government's approach to history. The culture of the Achis is, as described in various ways in this volume, is present, case and point. We read of their music and poetry, their myths and customs that connect the hunting way of life with a sense of belonging deeply to the earth and to the forest. We do not have to sentimentalize or rationalize their ways, or forget that, for example, as Eric Wolf notes, their loyalty is limited to the tribe, and that even alien Achis are enemies. We can concede that a way of life centered on hunting is more precarious than others, while at the same time we can admire those human virtues that such a way of life calls upon and brings into high relief. As Wolf points out, and I agree most completely, it smacks of arrogance to justify an obligation to preserve the Achis on the ground that they have something to teach us, if I may take this phrase in the sense in which I believe it to be intended, and recast it as having something worth scientific today. No, the right of their culture to be preserved does not rest on its anthropologic interest, but it does rest in part on their having something to teach us. For among the ways that they have invented of living together, of creating beauty and expressiveness, of resolving their conflicts and sorting out moral obligations, there may be some things we need to know or could profit from understanding. We are in no position to refuse anything that any human being has learned, and we must suppose that every culture in its own way, has learned some things that others do not know. So the first ground for ascribing rights to cultures is the cognitive one. They embody special knowledge, and knowledge is one of the basic needs of humankind. The second ground is aesthetic. Every culture has created something of aesthetic work, something beautiful in itself or expressive of a form of life, and it contains the seeds of further creativity, though we cannot predict the fruits. Thus a culture, like an individual, can be thought of as self-actualizing entity, and insofar as it fulfills its nature and helps to satisfy one of the basic needs of all humankind, cultures ought to be allowed to follow their bent and to bring forward what they can. The third ground is moral. We saw earlier that culture is a necessary condition for the realization of many values, perhaps of most certainly the highest, and that it makes possible a life on a moral plane. Therefore, culture in any of its concrete manifestations is entitled to our concerns for any existence and its integrity. In honoring it, we reaffirm our commitment to being responsible moral agents. Every culture, therefore, has a right to be and to be whole. All this is not to brush aside the fact that there must be conflicts between cultures, and that in these conflicts, one culture will sometimes maim or destroy another. But as with conflicts between human individuals, what is crucial is to see the situations from a moral point of view, recognizing the rights of both parties and seeking a just solution by weighing the stringency of competing rights, adjusting, compromising, recalling as far as possible. It goes without saying that such an approach has hardly ever been adopted, but that does not make it any less a moral duty. There will even be extreme cases of self-defense in which one culture is justified in destroying another, when, for example, the other culture is aggressively expansive and ineradicably so. This seems not at all to be true of the Achis, who, according to all reports, do not attack members of other societies and are not burdened by an ideology that requires them to condemn and treat cruelly those with other cultural ways. It is, on the contrary, the highly aggressive and ruthlessly expansive modern Western civilization that impinges on them, driving them from their homes and haunts to make way for farms, mines, and roads. The burden of justification lies on our side in this case, and there are grave doubts that it can be met. In general, it must always be hard to demonstrate beforehand that no peaceful adjustment of rights can be found to resolve a cultural confrontation, and therefore there is always hope for a solution. The tragic fact is that so very few government officials anywhere in the world are even able to think in these terms when their people have trouble taking land away from lesser breeds without the law. So this is, example of their imperialism. He's talking about, US imperialism and Western imperialism. They, fabricate, they, falsify. They are fascist, anti-democratic, white supremacist quacks. They are quacks that rewrite the history, and then they make a pretense for imperialism because they did the right thing everywhere they went. Indonesia, Indochina, the genocide of the Achis, South America, Nicaragua, Chile, Guatemala. They all did the right thing. Because we did the right thing, we can slaughter again. They're racist liars, quacks of the US government and their fraud public and their fraud, congressmen. All of the contributors to this volume have expressed wonder that the condition of the Achis has aroused so little interest in the United States. There has been no outcry, though surely this is no ordinary tale of wrong and suffering. The United States government may in significant part be responsible for this. It was not ever so, but we have seen in recent administrations a continual hardening that such matters. Once the policy is set and we decide that prospects of military and commercial advantage require unanswering support to some foreign totalitarian ruler, we refuse to hear the cries of anguish from the people who are kept unfree with our active help. Who in our State Department would dare to speak for the Achis and when that would be embarrassing for the rulers of Paraguay. The U.S. put General Stroessner in power, and he's alluding to the U.S. government's genocide of the Achi Indians. It's a U.S. government-sponsored genocide. They paid for it, they trained the people in Paraguay for it, and they, helped enact the genocide of the poor Indians in Achi, the white quacks of the U.S. government. But there is also a second explanation of our deadly and culpable silence. I believe one that goes deep into the darkness of our national experience, which makes it very hard for us to face up to just this kind of problem. It touches us too sharply by holding a mirror to our obscurely troubled consciences. Most nations are now existing have been significantly shaped by conquest. Without military slaughter, their present forms would be very different from what it is. But the United States is one of the few nations whose growth involved the complete destruction of whole peoples and cultures, many of them, and the near destruction of many others. In 1776, there were about 2.5 million Europeans to the former British colonies, and very probably many more native Indians living free. By 1900, the United States had a population of nearly 76 million, and there were fewer than 240,000 Indians doomed to reservations. Massacre, starvation, disease, deculturation are, of course, the explanation of the U.S. government's mass murder against the ethnic Indians in the United States. The ethnic Indians were slaughtered by U.S. guns and, tortured, raped, and, pillaged. Their land was pillaged and taken over by the imperialist, fascist, anti-democratic, racist quacks of the U.S. government. The figures may not be well known, but the basic fact that we grew and prospered by genocide and ethnocide has emerged more and more clearly into general awareness in recent years. Clearly enough to give many Americans, especially in those days when we want so desperately to celebrate our virtues, the terrifying sense that if we ourselves allowed to dwell on this unpleasant stain in our history, we will be in the danger of feeling not guilt, of course, but shame. We could not reasonably feel guilty for the acts themselves, the killing and treaty breakings, for example, for they were not our actions. We could reasonably feel guilty because we are today the beneficiaries of those crimes, and we are still far from dealing justly with the Indians. But two things stand in the way. First, true guilt is peculiarly painful and threatens to unsettle complacency by urging remedial action, which would entail the sacrifice of material comfort. For one example, consider the 435 remaining Havuspai of Arizona, whose situation is recounted in a pamphlet just recently come to hand from the American Association of Indian Affairs. They seek restoration of their unquestionable rights to land on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, from which the National Park Service evicted them, and without which they are crushed by poverty, unable to preserve religious traditions or bring up children in cultural ways. But restoration would interfere with plans to expand the Grand Canyon National Park to make room for more hikers. If we really acknowledge cultural rights, we would feel morally obliged to grant the Havuspai their historically deserved title, and that would mean giving up some room for hiking. Second, guilt depends on acknowledgement of responsibility and of wrong choice. And one of the worst aspects of our moral situation is that, with the help of our historians, we have largely succeeded in persuading ourselves that what we did to the Indians, it was not wrong, but right, or at least historically inevitable, and so excusable. That's the white, racist John Winthrop Sr. and its U.S. government. Quacks, they're historical, fascist, anti-democratic, censoring quacks of the U.S. government. They're racist quacks and ethnic mass murder, hateful, sadistic, cruel, detached butchers. Contrary to fact speculations about historical events, and no doubt risky, and in this matter verge upon the unimaginable, when we wonder what of course our history would have taken, what shape our nation would be today, had we dealt more fairly with the Indians from the start, as we did very occasionally and inconstantly. Such an alternative may not be worth thinking about. But if we cannot answer the question, what if, either way, then neither can we comfort ourselves by saying that all deceit and killing were inevitable. If it is this myth of inevitability, however arrived at, that encourage us to evade guilt and to suppress shame by transforming the moral question into one of utility and replacing remorse with the satisfaction of successful calculation. All those Indian debts then become a trade-off for progress. What are some few million of primitive lives against the welfare of now 212 million whites? Once we have brought ourselves successfully to this attitude, it is no wonder that we also burden our hearts to the destruction of the Achi. Too bad if they stand in the way of Paraguay's economic development and must be wasted. They have the misfortune to sit upon a frontier, and our history shows which way is the destiny of frontiers to move. But what we must struggle against these new tendencies in ourselves if we are to become whole agents and free ourselves of those deep divisions in our society and in our individual hearts that have already surfaced so clearly in our ambivalent attitude towards bicentennial. I mean, first, the thought that our past was inevitable and therefore not to be morally deplored. We cannot be sure what parts of it were inevitable and what parts were not. But a great deal of the cruelty in history was not required for the achievement of any reasonable end. Indian hunts among the Achi or casual enslavement of children, the deliberate disruption of tradition and customs that gave point to their lives. These are choices being made today. There is no inevitability about them, and they have no moral justifications. But I also mean, second, the paralysis that comes from fear or shame. Rod McClay, one of our most perceptive radio commenters, reprints in The Guilty Bystander, a brief broadcast from Paris in November 1969, in which he remarked, in France, according to my colleague Bernard Redmond, the residue of shame lingers from a series of colonial wars in Indochina and Algeria. And this may be why stories of the massacre in My Lai are neither big news nor the subject of varying sorts of comment here. It is true that as we condemn the Paraguayan officials for the treatment of the Achis, we are brought face to face in a kind of self-administered ad hominem argument with our own past, which is painful to recall. When one is, if not a killer, then at least the descendant, the protector, and the beneficiary of killers, it may be thought hypocritical of him, or in some way morally unsuitable, to condemn another for the same actions. But this is a fallacy. Certainly if I, who am blameworthy, blame another, the judgment is not falsified by the judge's fault. We ought not, of course, to try to escape our responsibility towards living victims in our crimes by distracting ourselves with crimes of others. That is indeed a moral failure. But we have not lost the right, nor in fact set aside this duty of speaking in our defense of the Achis, while there is still time to defend them and of condemning their persecutors. We must hope in our world that our worlds will come in time to be a writ rather than an epitaph. In his eloquent essay, Genocide and Bereavement, James Shatan has shown what still might be done in a concocted effort to rehumanize those Achi that remain and have not been spiritually destroyed. Their culture might yet be mended and their society restored to protect hunting areas. The other question is, Shaitan suggests, whether we can save ourselves. Each time we turn away from gross injustices, we intensify the emotional anesthesia, that moral immunization, as he puts it, which subtly but firmly modifies our own culture in horrifying directions. The anonymous structures of abstract power in our society that have standardized to an unparalleled degree the conversation of people into an interchangeable units, to quote Shaitan once more, and strengthen the very weakening of our capacity for moral indignation and of our resistance to wrongs, whether committed against ourselves or others. Our leaders tell us that we must be tough about these things and show no pity if pity interferes with foreign policy. But if we lose the power to pity, what end shall justify our pursuit of that policy? So you can see the U.S. government, the fabricating quacks, the falsifying quacks of the U.S. government, their mass media quacks, covered up this genocide in Paraguay. And that is this book, Genocide in Paraguay, Chapter 6, Reflections on Genocide and Ethnocide, a good chapter describing the whole story. And then the next chapter is Genocide and Bereavement by Shames Chatan. It's an excellent chapter. I will read that next time. It is a psychiatrist that is a Canadian that was, a Holocaust survivor. He goes through the whole story of the genocide in Paraguay and and he compares it to the Nazi extermination of the Jews. He compares the American genocide in Paraguay of the Indians to the Nazi extermination of the Jews. They are very comparable. And the fabricating quacks of the U.S. government, the white frauds of the U.S. government, they promote the wrong history and then as a pretense to continuing genocides and ethnicides, continuing colonialism and imperialism. So we're going to continue with our presentation. Basically, the next book, the next thing I'm going to read here is Dispossessing the Indian. It's going to be a short amount, and this is, again, the native Indian. 153, page 153 to 154, just a short little excerpt. British policy, however, as we have seen illustrated in various chapters of this book, allowed no particular place for the Indian. In a sense, he was then a non-person. British and colonials tended to use the Indians and then eliminate them or shove them aside. In the end, there was no real home left for the American Indians. Here again is a historical process that one might observe by scanning hundreds of treaties with exchanges of gifts, promises, and wampum belts. And you remember Spain, he contrasts Spain in the previous chapter, which I don't have time to read, but he basically says that the Spanish gave the Indians rights. They gave them land rights, and they gave them, true rights that the Spanish had provided. They mingled with the people, and they mixed with the people. Unlike the white supremacist frauds, the racist purifying frauds of the U.S. government who forced the Indians into subjugation and still mass murder in South America under the pretext of racial purity, racist white American quack frauds. It was a woodland Indians who had the longest series of contacts with Americans during the formative period of the American nation. They were the tribesmen who generally gave corn to the fledgling settlements at Jamestown and Plymouth. Indeed, they may have saved these small outposts of Europe from disappearing in the shadows of early American history that close off details of first attempts at colonization. Once the colonies were going, the colonists saturated their public records with matters concerning the Indians. Their archives, as we know them today, are punctuated with accounts of treaties, wars, messages from headsmen, chiefs, and sachems, and news about enemy Indians who allowed themselves to become allies of the Spaniards or French. As the routes of settlement reached into the coastal river valleys for the traders, squatters, and land speculators, filled records with controversies about their activities. Indians. The Niagara of paperwork regarding them in the colonial archives leaves no doubt that there was continual border contact between whites and natives as the frontier moved westward. Although the daily contact was there, the kind of no man's zone or neutral belt of land seems to always have been separated Indian territory from the zigzagging white cutting edge of the settlement. It is in this tinderbox zone where, more often than not, friction so easily sparked a conflagration of violence. So you can see that was pretty straightforward. The U.S., their treaties, their fabricated treaties, the lies that they have peddled across the board about Indian history, gives them the right to have genocided the Indians of the American subcontinent. This was a genocide, and it was a ruthless, fabricating farce of the U.S. government to rewrite this history in their own fascist, anti-democratic stance. Just a total anti-democratic group of fascist frauds, white supremacists, fascist frauds. Next, we're going to read, this is another part, which is I thought it was a good part, page 170 to 171. With all their contributions and achievements in government, politics, language, medicine, agriculture, and ecology, it is nevertheless true that the woodland tribes, as well as most other Indians of North America, were concerned with the daily business of living, whereas the whites, especially those settlers of the British North American colonies, were largely concerned with getting. Their Puritan ethics, so clearly spelled out in the writings of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, as well as the Puritans themselves, stressed thrift and industry. By contrast, there was something almost sacrilegious about the lifestyle of the woodland Indians. From John Smith to Thomas Jefferson, we find a whole series of Anglo-American writers who want to put these indolent natives to work in the tilling fields. The Indian, exposed to the marketplace economy and technology of the white man, could no longer continue his way of simple living. He had to be more concerned with getting in order to survive. The resulting degradation of the woodland tribes, and finally the preaching of Handsome Lake's Jawa. The good news helped some of them to rise out of their demoralized state, as did the Iroquois. Other tribes had their leaders too, such as the great Sequoia among the Cherokees and John Ross, the Cherokee leader, who helped his people live after removal to the harsh new land. Unfortunately, whites still tend to associate Indian with dancers, feathers, arts and crafts, and bad whiskey. Such associations, part of the historic stereotype of the Indian, have prevented us from appreciating the tremendous potentialities of Indian wisdom. It is even feasible that Indian tribalism could have a successful impact upon the modern world in a sense that it gives self-respect to the individual as well as the group. Furthermore, it is closely identified with the land because tribal groups have been rooted in specific land areas for thousands of years. It may be the way of life of the Indian, as well as other savage tribes, in the language of older evolutionism, with the web of significance in which man obtains an acceptable relationship with the world at large, the universe, and the ecology surrounding them, may have true meaning in America today. In the tribe, competition and individual initiative are subordinated into the idea of harmonious whole. The peoples are able to adjust more easily to each other. The tribal way of judging a man by what he accomplishes is also significant because of its simplicity. If a man's IQ is not computed, his potential becomes an object of possible praise. And if his wealth is not hoarded to be compared with that of others, he may be judged simply by what he does. Even more important, the tribal man never is or was historically the conservative and unchangeable, that he did not adapt to new situations. Certainly, the story of humanity would have been vastly different if mankind had not adjusted to necessary changes. Can modern America actually benefit from Indian tribalism as part of the American heritage? Is it possible that our huge bureaucracies and polluted, overgrown cities, unmanageable and seemingly uncontrollable, are our only alternatives? That's his, little statement on, what we owe the woodland Indians. The U.S. government doesn't believe they owe anyone anything. They're racist frauds, white frauds of Roman Catholicism. Continuing on, page 171 to 172, we're going to, read that, 171 to 172. We know that Judeo-Christian traditions of man's dominion over nations have been at least partly responsible for the spread of white American style of technology. Somehow, we seem to have built a value structure out of this heritage, which supports technological advance in the belief that this kind of progress coincides with God's will. The monotheism of early Christianity liberated mankind from the religions of antiquity, which tended to view a universe with all things having a certain spiritual essence. Although Christianity had its spirits, more were contained in animals, plants, or sacred rocks or waterfalls. As a distinguished historian of science argued, to a Christian, a tree can be no more than a physical fact. The whole concept of the sacred grove is alien to Christianity and to the ethos of the West. Despite such an interpretation, it is hard to prove by close examination of Genesis, for example, that there is biblical justification for the ravaging of the earth, that we have divine license to dig, chop, crush, and kill as we wish. As the teachings of St. Francis set forth the idea that it is the duty of all men to show respect for animal life, domestic animals and birds, as well as wildlife. Americans seem, however, to persuade themselves that in exploitation for immediate wealth, they can do as they please without accounting for their actions. Now, perhaps, we may consider difficult questions that the American Indian heritage poses for us. Should we have a concern, even a moral obligation, for a bear, a grove of redwoods, a sacred lake, or even a wolf, or coyote, or an alligator? From a practical standpoint, should we not regard the land as a depreciable resource in only finite supply? If we are able to reassess our values, surely the American Indian concept of Mother Earth will help us on the way to comprehending ecological righteousness in the modern world. So, pretty much the U.S. government, the racist fraud whites, the quacks, the American quacks, rewrote the history. They committed a genocide against the American Indians. They followed it up with a genocide in Paraguay against the Achi and all different tribes. And, they hide the history. They rewrite the history with fascist censorship, torture of American citizens, censorship, rewriting the history to a white supremacist fictional novel, and then releasing it, and then re-imperializing and re-ethnic slaughter. Okay, the last thing is this book, Washington's War on Nicaragua. I thought two parts of it, basically, Moonstruck was fabrication of the war. Moonstruck was the fabrication of the American war in Nicaragua. There was an organization called WACL, just a little background. WACL, WACL. It was basically an Axis organization of fascist white supremacists. People people from Mississippi, from the Confederate South, the racist, seething, angry whites from the Confederate South, joined an organization that was supported by South African racists, as well as many Italian fascists, German Hitlerian fascists. They all joined this organization that was participating in international discussions about overtaking other countries and colonialism, and that is what we are referring to when we read this. While researching their book on the World Anti-Communist League, journalists Scott Anderson and John Lee Anderson received a letter from a former League member. In considering the World Anti-Communist League, you have entered a world of ideological fanaticism, racialism, ignorance, and fear, which is almost beyond the comprehension of the average American. Your subject matter is a collection of Oriental fascists, militarists, right-wing terrorists who put bombs on civilian aircraft, death squads, assassins, criminals, and many people who are as much opposed to democracy as they are of communism. With chapters now in over 90 countries on 6 continents, WACL was founded in 1966 by 2 dictatorships, South Korea and Taiwan, and the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, which united East European fascists who are valued for their anti-communism and resettled in the West with the aid of Vatican and U.S. and British intelligence. Formed with U.S. government funds, the ABN is described as the largest and most important umbrella for Nazi collaborators in the world. The late Yaroslav Stetsko, chairman of the ABN and longtime WACL leader, met with President Reagan in the White House in 1983. The Ukrainian Stetsko insisted in the 1941 Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union and led the occupation of Lvov during the period which Stetsko and Lvov, and by his own claim, in charge of the city, an estimated 7,000 residents, mostly Jews, were murdered. Later-day fascist Robert Dispossesing, a League member, once told German reporters that he admired Hitler because your Europeans had the right idea. You saw the Jews were behind communism and you started to kill them, as well as the blacks. The World Anti-Communist League is an outgrowth of the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, formed in 1954, also with U.S. government support by the South Korean Central Intelligence Agency and Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang. In 1947, before losing to Mao on the Chinese mainland, Chiang's forces crushed an independence movement on occupied Formosa, Taiwan, with a massacre of some 20,000 Chinese. Taiwan became a laboratory for total and unconventional warfare. It established a political warfare cadres academy. Duobasun is a graduate with the assistance of WACL associate Ray Klein, who was a CIA station chief in Taiwan from 1958 to 1962, then CIA Deputy Director for Intelligence, State Department Director of Intelligence, and founder of the U.S. Global Strategy Council. U.S. military personnel taught at the academy, drawn largely from the U.S. military group in Taiwan. In Latin America, WACL's affiliates formed the Latin American Anti-Communist Confederation, In 1974, CAL introduced a resolution of WACL's annual conference seeking the overthrow of the U.S. government, which was considered soft on communism, and installation of military junta in the United States. CAL was organized by the Mexican Ticos, whose leaders were the principal authors of the 1962 Complot contra la Iglesia, conspiracy against the church, in response to the liberalism of the Vatican Council II, and the complot had been the one cue of the most unscathingly anti-Semitic and unabashedly pro-Nazi tracts elsewhere written. So you can see all of the, the South American groups, they were taking cues by the U.S. government, the white supremacist, racist American frauds, the white quacks of the U.S. government, and their mass murdering, anti-ethnic, sadistic, cruel, detached butchers. We're going to read Moonstruck. That's the next thing. There were only 3 sections that I wanted to read. Moonstruck was one of them, and then we were going to read, basically just Moonstruck. So Wacko provided a strong base for the Reverend Sun Myung Moon's Unification Church, which is closely tied to the KCIA. Known for its totalitarian indoctrination of young people, in 1982, Moon arranged 2,000 couples at random for marriage in a mass ceremony at Madison Square Garden. In the 1940s, Moon's first church practiced the ritual of blood separation. Female church members were required to have sexual relations with Moon to clear themselves of the taint of Satan. The Unification Church supportedly left Wacko in 1975 when Moon denounced it as fascist after a frustrated takeover attempt. But Moon continued to be represented by the powerful Japanese Unification Church through its front group, Shokyo Rengo, Victory Over Communism, founded by such men as the late Yoshio Kodama, leader of the Japanese organized crime syndicate, the Yakuza, and Roichi Sasakawa, who has described himself as the world's wealthiest fascist. Wacko members work with the Unification Church in support of the Contras through Mooney affiliates like CAUSA, and the Moon-owned Washington Times, established in 1982. So the Washington Times was part of the Contra mass murder terrorist group that was slaughtering Nicaraguans. The Washington Times, our own Washington butchers of the U.S. government, allowed the Washington Times to be infiltrated by fascism and a murder campaign against the poor Nicaraguan peasants, the Hispanics of Nicaragua. This is a racist group of white savages, white anti-democratic fascist savages of the U.S. government. Wacko members CAUSA, the Confederation of Association for the Unity, originally Unification of the Societies of America, was founded in 1980 by Colonel Bohee Pak, in the former KCIA operative, who is Moon's top deputy, and Kim Sang-in, former KCIA station chief in Mexico City. CAUSA's first executive director was Warren Richardson, formerly general counsel to the Liberty Lobby. Mooney connections with the U.S. right and the Reagan administration are extensive. For example, retired Major General Daniel Graham, a member of CAUSA's advisory board, heads the Star Wars lobby group. High Frontier F. Lynn Bauchi, president of the Council for Inter-American Security and member of the Committee of Santa Fe, helped organize 2 CAUSA conferences. Washington Times editor Arnaud de Borchevez serves on Ray Klein's U.S. Global Strategy Council, a Reagan advisory group. The Strategy Council's executive director is retired General E. David Wallner, president of CAUSA World Services. Washington Times columnists include Ray Klein's son-in-law, Roger Fontaine, a Committee of Santa Fe member and former Reagan Latin American advisor, and Jeremy O'Leary, former Special Assistant to National Security Advisor William Clark. So major Washington Times columnists and editors were part of the Reagan advisory group in the Nicaraguan Contra, mass murder. The Nicaraguan Contra mass murder campaign by the U.S. government had the Washington Times funding it in part by the racist white quacks. Moon's money has become a major source of nourishment for new right leaders and organizations. The Unification Church contributed $775,000 in 1984 to the Conservative Alliance, a nonprofit lobbying group headed by the late John Terry Dolan, who also led the National Conservative Political Action Committee and served on CAUSA's USA Advisory Board. Direct mail fundraiser Richard Viguerie was bailed out of debt in 1987 when Bohe Pack's U.S. Property Development Corporation purchased Viguerie, Virginia's headquarters. Vergerie has served on the board of Moon-dominated American Freedom Coalition, which was the biggest new direct mail client as of 1987. Moon's quest for global theocracy is no secret. In 1978, a House subcommittee tracing the Unification Church's connections with South Korean security and intelligence forces quoted Moon, "If we manipulate 7 nations at least, the United States, England, France, Germany, Soviet Russia, and maybe Korea and Japan, we can get a hold of the whole world." By the time Moon was released from a U.S. prison in the summer of 1985, after serving a year-long sentence for perjury and falsification of documents, his images had been dramatically rehabilitated. His supporters claimed he was unjustly imprisoned for tax evasion, and people of diverse political backgrounds saw him as a persecuted religious leader. Right-wing American Senator Orrin Hatch lauded Moon for providing American youth with a religious alternative to communism. In a January 1987 God's Day speech, Moon showed his image may have mellowed, but not his views. Without following it, even President Reagan is guided by Father Moon. History will make a position of Reverend Moon clear, and his enemies, the American population and government, will bow down to him. That is Father's tactic, the natural subjugation of the American government and population. Reagan administration Mooney ties are extensive enough for that analysis for the Pentagon-funded Institute of Defense Analysis warned the effects of their exposure could have on 1984 elections. Current Mooney involvement with government officials, contractors, and contractees could be a major scandal if efforts are not taken to stop their growing influence and weed out their current Mooney involvement in governments. The president stands a good chance of being portrayed in the media as poor, naive, and incompetent. As it turned out, Mooneygate was just one more scandal Reagan avoided in the years preceding the Iran-Contra scandal of the U.S. government. So you can see the racist, mass-murdering, anti-ethnic, hateful, sadistic, cruel, detached, white vigilante American government. She refers in her book, Holly Scar, to the Washington Ministry of Truth and Propagandist disinformation, fabrication, and Winthrop-style history. Basically, like we said, I can't read the Indonesian genocide. It's too long. The video is going too long. But, I want to just, reiterate the most important thing that we have to understand is that the American Congress, justice system, president, and its people have conspired together to, they have universally agreed that using torture techniques against American citizens who are ethnics or non-whites and are presenting democratic idea in all media forums, are forcing those people through torture techniques and U.S. public fraud action, quack action, submission of them to censorship, the rewriting of history, and removing what really happened. They remove the real history and replace it with a white supremacist fictional novel devoid of any historical value and useful for promoting American imperialism, colonialism, and ethnic slaughter. This is a group of white quacks and mass murderers of ethnics, enjoying the prestige on the world stage at the expense of hardworking ethnic peoples who were formerly white man's colonial subjects. A group of white racists fabricating quacks with a history reflected by total fraud. These are sadistic, angry, detached, cruel, psychopathic misfits and angry, anti-democratic, fascist mass murderers and genocidal butchers of the United States of America. They love anti-democratic fascism as an easy fix to their ethnic slaughter campaign, racist imperialism, and jealous delusion of ethnics, censorship, fabrication, and reinvention, fascist depiction, and anti-democratic replacement. They're white quack, psychopathic misfits. And you can see the white vigilantes of the U.S. government in their, campaigns Basically they did all of their stuff. They did all of their things. I just want to finish with one little reason that I'm doing this podcast. All the time when I used to walk around America as a young child, I always got propaganda from the government. They always used to make me feel like I was racist, that I was somehow a racist Indian, a racist person of Indian ethnicity. Always had to know my ethnicity. I was always forced to understand what my ethnicity is because of the racial profiling, mass murder sadists. That being said, I always used to get propaganda from the fabricated anti-democratic facts that they are champions of Black Africa. They also communicated themselves as fabricated champions of China, fabricated champions of South America and mestizo races, as well as champions of ethnic Muslims. I agree that the American government are champions in white supremacist fabricated facts and fraud. World champions of ethnic slaughter in Black Africa, Chinese slaughter champions, Hispanic slaughter champions, and ethnic Muslim slaughter champions. You are racist white quack champions of ethnic anti-democratic fascist white supremacist genocide, historical fabricator white supremacists. You are champion white vigilantes and Confederate American linchpin champions of white vigilante justice. And so I just want to make sure that you remember this military and terror in Indonesia. I'm going to just read the last part of this paper, the last conclusion, so that we can conclude with it. Leadership of the revolution. The question of the subjective factor of the revolution, especially that of leadership, is naturally the principal one. Guided by the Political Bureau's document of self-criticism, the PKI, or the Communist Party in Indonesia, will, in the course of revolutionary struggle, surely improve its understanding and grasp of revolutionary theory and ideology, do away with the shortcomings caused by the previous erroneous line of the party, carry out the tasks and duties laid down by the document of self-criticism in the course of concrete practice of the revolution, serve the people wholeheartedly, maintain its independence in the Revolutionary United Front, and persist in the struggle to carry out its historic mission through to the end. The patriotic and democratic politicians and political forces who possess a tradition of struggle for independence and in defense of the gains of this struggle, but who are now being suppressed, humiliated, and split by the Haji Suharto fascist regime for the purpose of turning them into its puppets, will surely smash the yokes imposed on them through struggle. They will surely again raise the banner of the 1945 August Indonesian Revolution, the banner which the enemies of the revolution have trampled on and tarnished, and together with the vast masses of the people, advance wave upon wave in the struggle to carry out the unfinished tasks of the revolution. The dark night will finally be over and dawn will come, when the sun will radiate its first red rays to the east. Let such traitors of Suharto and his clique of right-wing generals, supported by the American government, tremble in fear in face of the people's struggle. Let the flames of the 1945 August Revolution burn anew, furiously, ushering the people to power. Again, the U.S. government's Indonesian genocide, the fascist white quacks of the U.S. government, Lyndon B. Johnson, supplied weapons, murder ammunition, and all sorts of things to the Indonesian military, General Haji Suharto. And then they, Jimmy Carter thought he was a, champion of human rights, thought the mass murderer Suharto was a champion of human rights. These Americans are champions of white lynch mob justice. That's the only champions they are. White racist lynch mob champions. Again, Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'll put all my notes in the description section so you can have a description of my thought process and what I said so that you don't get confused. All the book references will be in there. Have a great day. I'll be back in 2 days, on Friday with another episode on, we're going to do another chapter in Genocide in Paraguay, as well as additional stuff. Thank you very much for your time. Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.